Hello, welcome back to Cloak of Obscurity. Today I'm reading from chapter 10 on the Cliffs of the Bell. Sadie and I both wanted to see Lee as soon after the trial as possible. We managed to work our way through the crowd. I stood behind Sadie, looking over folks' head, and she forged her mighty bulk between them as I directed, until we found the spot where Dolores had Lee tucked away safely in a quiet corner. No one appeared to be paying them any attention. Now that Lee had been declared not to be a murderer, she was of no interest to the public. Sadie threw her arms about the elf girl, uttering incoherent cries of relief and affection. Lee said nothing, as her face was wedged firmly between Sadie's breasts. Finally, Sadie released her hold. "Oh, you dear, dear thing," she said. "You poor, sweet, dear little lamb. I'm not going to ask you why you lied, because I know it's a man's world, and sometimes it does seem as good as a curse to be born a woman." She turned to Dolores. "Where's that Malcolm gone?" Dolores shrugged. "I think I saw him leaving with those folks from the tavern he visits. He's probably going out drinking again." Sadie snorted. "Well, do you think he'll be wanting supper?" "No," Dolores said, puzzled. "I doubt he'll be home till after midnight." "Perfect," Sadie said. "You bring this little one on to my place. I'll give you both supper, and we'll go down to the Mystery. Should be a good show tonight." Dolores nodded. "Thank you, Sadie. It's been too long since I've been to a theater. Lee, we'd best be getting home," she said to the girl. You need a bath, and I'll give you one of my gowns to wear. You've got to get out of those boys' clothes. Your legs are showing." "I've got hose on," Lee said softly. "But they show your legs," Dolores protested. "Come on, lass." Sadie hugged her cousin goodbye. "I'll see you tonight," she said. "Right now I'd better get back to the snake and egg. I left Anna in charge. And though she's a fair hand in the kitchen, she's probably been shortchanged by customers. Dozen more times by now. She's no head for money." Lee had been giving me odd, sidelong glances through much of this exchange. I decided I'd better try and explain Elira, the dancing girl, to her, lest she lose all respect for me. Lee," I said. "Yes?" Her eyes were wide. That elf, that girl Damien was talking about?" "Oh, yes, Eddie. Tell us all about her," Sadie said with a grin. I tried not to look at Sadie. "She was a dancer that one of my family hired for Tom's party. I walked with her to make sure she got home safely, and that's all." "I believe you," Lee said with a shy smile. "What I want to know is, how does your king know you?" It's a long story. Something happened. I was a kid, and maybe I'll tell you later." Damien surprised me for a second time that day when I returned to the Snake and Egg. He was waiting for me outside the tavern. I wouldn't have thought he'd been caught dead on that side of town, and I told him so. "Well, I wanted to talk to you, cousin," he said, smiling blandly. "May we go in and sit down?" "Of course," I said, leading him into the tavern. "Somewhere private?" he said when I gestured to the tables. "All right," I said. "Sadie, we're going to be down in the cellars. Could you bring my cousin something to drink?" I led Damien down the stairs. There was a table and several stools tucked in beneath the stairs, as well as a few benches for those nights when Sadie's patrons overflowed the dining room. I leaned back against a beer barrel as Sadie came down after us with a pair of clay mugs. "So," she said as she filled them, "your cousin Damien." She plunked the beers down on the table between us and gave my cousin a look as if she'd smelled something. suppose you are a pretty fella, for all you're so skinny. Let me know if I can get anything else for you boys. Damien watched her broad rump disappear around the staircase with an expression somewhere between astonishment and horror. She's, damn, he said finally. I mean, I've heard folks say your landlady had some size on her, but Eddie, she's fatter than your sister Deborah. I crossed my arms, the better to resist smacking him, and said, aside from trying to insult my sister, didn't you have something you were going to say to me? Oh, I didn't mean to insult her. I mean, Edward, you've got to admit the folks on your side of the family are all pretty well solid. It dawned on me that as I did outweigh my cousin, I could probably beat him to the ground without any trouble. Have some beer? Oh, no, he said. Never touch the stuff. Gives me gas. Oh, is that a fact? He really didn't know how to behave, did he? I reflected, trying to calm my twitching fingers. What I came here for, Edward, he said, was to warn you. Warn me? I asked. Of what? Drinking beer and farting? Damien laughed. Well, yes, but of course. But mostly, no. You need to stay away from the Tanner household now. You fulfilled your promise to that elf. I have to admit, she really does look exactly like a boy. And now you should wash your hands of them. Why? I asked. Well, isn't it obvious? He said. Malcolm thinks you're involved in Allison's death. But I'm not, I said. I'm innocent, and he should know that by now. Damien shook his head. Malcolm is not a particularly rational fellow. Furthermore, he knows full well you have access to powers unavailable to most men. What? He said. Do you think he believes I cast some sort of spell to get you all to testify for me? Perhaps, he said with a shrug. At any rate, he seems to dislike and mistrust you. And he's already assaulted you twice. He's a strong-looking fellow. He could kill you, Eddie, if he tried. Damien's ice blue eyes met mine. For your own sake and the sake of the family, you need to leave this alone. The elf is free, and they've got the man who did it locked up. There's no proof that Dennis did it, I said. And there's no proof that he didn't. And who had a better reason to get rid of her than her betrothed? Damien countered. You know his guild is likely to honor his marriage contract and award him Allison's property now. Unless, of course, he's hanged, I said. Well, of course, and that seems likely. The murder's solved. You have no more business in it, so stay away from these people, Edward, for your own good. He kept saying that, but I knew he had little love for me or concern for my well-being. Still, he did have a fairly strong sense of family loyalty, I mused, despite his aspirations of nobility. He was probably doing this for grandfather's sake and for the sake of the family's reputation. Thank you, I said. I'll keep that in mind. Damien left promptly. No doubt he was afraid my low-class friends would contaminate him. I went up to my room. On my way, I gave his untouched beer to one of Sadie's regulars. I gave mine to another. I had, after all, been told to drink nothing stronger than water by the priestess at the temple. Any water as strong as Nat's beer would have to be called mud. After spending some time reading spell books in my room, I realized I couldn't take my mind off the death of the shoemaker's daughter, no matter what my cousin had said. The rain had stopped, and I decided I should head out to the Cliffs of the Bell to see if there was any sign there of what had happened to Allison. I probably should have done it sooner. I packed my bag with a few things that I might need, but on my way out the door, Sadie, Lee, and Dolores waylaid me. Dolores had done her best with the elf. The girl had been scrubbed until her brown skin shone and put into what must have been one of Dolores' better gowns, made of faded, rust-colored linen. The dress was too big, though. As small as Dolores was, she was nowhere near as dainty as Lee. They tried to pull it in by crisscrossing the side lacings over Lee's back. The result was rather pitiful, and made all the more comic when Lee stood next to Sadie, since Sadie's side lacings commonly gaped open to a degree more than really was proper. With effort, I refrained from laughing. I managed to avoid actually eating the dinner Sadie pressed on me, through a combination of clever conversation and deft sleight of hand. I gave it all to the dog, under the table. Of course, Sadie wasn't really giving me her complete attention, as she had found a new mission in life, fattening up Lee. Lee finally begged for mercy, saying if she ate any more in the tight-laced dress she had on, she wouldn't be able to breathe. Sadie suggested loosening the dress, but then Dolores gently reminded them they were supposed to be heading to the mystery for play, and Lee invited me to come with them, and I didn't have the heart to refuse. The respectable theaters of Belcamp endeavor to make up for the illiteracy of the populace by presenting stories taken from the books of faith and other enlightened works. The mystery is not a respectable theater. After administering her customary evening harangue to her staff, Sadie led our party down the street to the theater. "You won't believe what happened the last show," she said. "Oh, tell me," Lee begged. "Well, first of all," Sadie said, "you remember how Terry Longshanks, he was the fellow as played the hero? Sir Thomas, you know, Thomas Trueheart. But, well, Terry, he was a hopeless drunkard, not Sir Thomas. He's heroic and noble and wonderful, but the actor, he kept bungling his lines, and he's been turned out. They sacked him. They hired a new chap." Sadie kept up the conversation all the way to the doors of the mystery, with Dolores occasionally getting one or two words in edgewise. I wasn't listening. For one thing, they were chattering along too quickly for me to follow, and for another, I was far too preoccupied with the day's trial. Things looked very bad for Dennis Cobbler. He certainly didn't seem the sort of fellow to plan a murder. But suppose, I thought, he had lied about his conversation with Allison. Suppose she really had insisted on his denouncing Melly and honoring his commitment to her. Suppose they'd quarreled. Suppose he'd followed her, unnoticed by the guard, out of the city, and continued their quarrel somewhere outside the walls, on the edge of a cliff, perhaps. Dennis might not be capable of premeditated murder, but a forceful slap to the face could be enough to send a girl reeling over the edge if she was standing in the wrong spot. Of course, that was supposing a lot, but so far, it was the only theory that made any sense to me. The play that night was as melodramatic and incomprehensible as ever. Didn't help that the sandy-haired young man who had been suddenly thrust into the leading role, replacing the drunken Terry, spent his entire evening looking bewildered and completely forgetting his lines. At least Nora, the actress hired as the princess in distress, was beautiful, and her voice was very sweet. She made the show more than merely bearable. All the same, I was out far later than I'd cared to be. I decided to sleep late the next morning and spend the afternoon combing the cliffs north of Belcamp. My great-uncle had been a priest, and he was very fond of the saying that life is what happens when one is busy making other plans. I was still sprawled out unconscious on my cot the next morning when Sadie came pounding at my door. Apparently, I had developed a reputation. Mellie's kinfolk had been spreading the story of her miraculous, well, in their eyes, miraculous, cure to anyone who would listen. Now a crowd of the sick and suffering were waiting for me downstairs, cluttering up the place, as Sadie put it, and she demanded that I fix them and get them out. Needless to say, I didn't leave the tavern that day. None of my visiting patients were anywhere near as ill as Mellie had been, thankfully. Otherwise, I would have likely collapsed from exhaustion. Even so, I got to a point in the late afternoon where I was so drained of strength, I had to tell Sadie to turn any newcomers away. I dragged myself up to my cot and turned in early. I had fewer clients the next day. I was just as busy, though. Sadie, bless her simple soul, was going through with Lee's childishly naive plan to find Allison's missing ring by holding a fish fry. Since this was an endeavor requiring more than the usual day's work, whenever I finished up with a client and tried to slip out, Sadie press-ganged me into work as a slavey in her kitchen. Her brothers and her nephews brought in their entire morning's catch to the Snake and Egg before the noon bell and stayed on to help. Dolores arrived at about the same time with Lee in tow. Once again the elf was tied into one of Dolores' gowns, and now she had plaited ribbons into her short hair, tying the stubby braids together at the nape of her neck. She still didn't look her age, but at least the brightly colored ribbons left no doubt that she wasn't a boy. We wound up working side by side. Lee chopped the heads and tails from the fish and passed them to me. I had the unenviable task of gutting them and searching their entrails for the ring. Lee caught me staring at her. Do you like my hair ribbons, Master Edward?" she asked. I had to be honest. I'm still not used to thinking of you as a girl, I said. "The ribbons are nice, though." "Oh," she said, and turned back to her work, decapitating a fish with a resounding thwack. By early afternoon, I had stopped seeing clients. I was too spattered with fish gore to cast spells effectively. Magic requires establishing the proper state of mind, and it's hard to concentrate on anything else when you smell like a chum bucket. It was as hot and crowded in the kitchen as I'd expected. I was scorched by spattering lard twice, and I forget how often folks stepped on my feet. I suppose I might not have minded it so much if I hadn't been so hungry. By mid-afternoon, the bread I'd had for breakfast might as well have been a memory of another lifetime. To complete my discomfort, my family descended upon the Snake and Egg in a horde and proceeded to humiliate me. They called me out of the kitchen. I'm sure I was quite the apparition, all blood-stained and bespangled with scales. My mother and sisters exclaimed in disgust. My nephew, Raglan, quite seriously informed me that I stank, as if I hadn't known. Father only raised an eyebrow, grinned, and then turned away to make loud and, in his opinion, complimentary comments on the size and shape of Anna's backside. Anna was used to that sort of thing, though, and calmly ignored him. Lee had never met any of my family before. She'd always been terribly shy around newcomers, but I suppose curiosity overwhelmed her. The chance to see the brood that had spawned me was too tempting to resist. She came creeping out of the kitchen, like a little aproned mouse, to stare at my noisy, ravenous kin as they gorged themselves on mountains of fried fish. Father spotted her first. "Oh, is that Lee?" he mumbled around a mouthful of food, gesturing in her direction with greasy fingers. I nodded dumbly. I could tell by the look on the elf's face she wasn't feeling prepared to meet strangers. Father, however, immediately hoisted himself up from his bench and bore down on the poor girl, bellowing. "So," he said, in a voice the entire tavern could hear, "you're the little wench the king's men thought was a killer?" He clapped his huge hands on her tiny shoulders and laughed. "What had they been drinking? You couldn't hurt a fly. I've eaten rabbits bigger than you." He turned to me. "You know, Eddie, I was really worried about you when I heard that this elf was really a girl and you hadn't figured it out yet, but now I understand why you were confused. I've seen bigger tits on a terrier bitch." If I had been a truly powerful wizard, I would have called lightning up to strike me dead right then. "You could definitely stand some feeding up," Father said to Lee. "You should spend more time around here. Sadie's done wonders for my boy. When he came back from his apprenticeship, he was worn down, skinny as a switch. Hardly knew him as my own son, but he's filling out nicely these days. And that girl Anna over there, now that's a real woman. She's got an ass as big as all outdoors and—" "Master Edward," Lee interrupted mercifully, "are you feeling well?" I forced myself to look up from the toes of my boots and meet her eyes. The little imp was smirking at me. "You look very warm," she said. Do you need some air?" Warm indeed. I'm sure my face was blazing crimson. I took the opportunity to escape. "Yes," I said. I think I'll step out for a moment. Tell Sadie, please." As I beat my retreat, Father called after me, "What you need is a beer." What I needed was to get well away from Father. I slipped up the back stairs to my room, where I changed into a less filthy shirt and picked up my bag. Fearing Sadie might corner me if I went back downstairs, I squeezed myself out the window and climbed down, clinging to the lathe work and jumping sideways to avoid the garbage pit. I made my slow way up to the north gate. I was followed by a dozen cats, who all seemed to think my boots smelled delicious. The cliffs north of Bell Camp were all of clay and stone, unsuitable for farming, and long since stripped of any trees larger than a sapling. Mostly they were covered with a tangle of scrubby bay myrtle and, thanks to the heat and rain of summer, a riot of prickly vines. There were a few narrow paths, carved through the thickets by the passage of the king's deer, and enlarged by repeated visits from furtive young folks. I disturbed a complete flock of lovers. As I tried to make my way to the cliffside, I managed to ward off the wine jug one young man pitched at my head. After a sweaty and unpleasant struggle through several tenacious patches of thorny brambles, I found my way to a path that ran along the cliff's edge. Now what? I wondered. I suppose I could try and find the exact spot where Allison had fallen, but I wasn't sure how. The tide was coming in. The rocks at the base of the cliffs were just barely visible. I started looking over the edge, and I found Allison's ring. It was hanging, caught in the twisted branches of a lone myrtle that clung defiantly to a cleft in the rock face. I knew what it had to be, though it was no more than a glint of silver in the dull afternoon light. I reached towards it and willed it up to my hand. It lay upon my palm, an insubstantial band of silver, split into a doubled knot, bent and scratched from wear. Such a trifling little thing it was, and yet Dennis' life might hang on what it could reveal. My hands shook as I took the incense from my bag. I had never used this spell on a dead subject before. I drew a pentagram in the dirt with the tip of my knife and sprinkled it with salt, hoping it would protect me. For all I knew, the White Lady's messengers had missed Allison, and her ghost was still wandering around the cliffs. I'd seen angry ghosts before. and in spite of what my master had told me, I believed they could kill. I sat down and lit the incense. For a while, I felt and saw nothing. Suddenly, the world fell out from under me, and I was high above the cliffs looking down. The sun had set. The moon was rising. A figure came stumbling through the thickets. It was Allison. Her dress was torn, and her face and hands were scratched and bleeding, her blood mingling with tears. The moonlight gleamed on her fair hair. She was alone. Staggering to the cliff's edge, she paused and tugged at her ring finger. She winced as if in pain, but got the band off her hand and dropped it over the side. Then, without warning, she threw herself after it. I felt myself falling, saw the dark sea rush up to meet me, and felt the sting and shock as I struck the water. Green-black waves closed over my head. For a while I struggled against them, but they were too strong, and I sank into blackness. Well, of course I'm going to leave it at a cliffhanger. It's what I do.